Hi, bird class. Good afternoon. I gotta say, you guys are getting really good at coloring on the screen. A lot better than when we first started doing this at the beginning of the semester. All right, so unfortunately, it's time to quit coloring. So I'm going to clear the drawings and move on. So as usual, we have a quiz and short answer questions due both before midnight on Sunday. We also only have 1 week left in the semester. So we're getting very, very close to the end. If there is anything that you wanted to talk about or wanted to learn about, and we haven't covered it, or anything you want me to repeat, send me an email as soon as possible, and I will be happy to pull something together on that topic. Okay. We were talking about invasive bird species in the US. And there are, as I mentioned, around 100, but we have any final assignments. The final assignments will be a review quiz and review short answer questions. Similar, the same types of review quizzes that we've had before. Review short answers, just like we've had before. There's no big end of the semester final exam or projects or anything like that. That's why your projects were due, what was it, a week ago? So you wouldn't have them right there at the end. All right. So we've got about 100 species of non-native birds that have established breeding populations. Most of them are in warm urban areas like Los Angeles and Miami. And I want to talk about a couple of different species. We were talking about these guys when we wrapped up last time. What are these birds? You guys remember? Mary, go ahead.
Are they hummingbirds?
Nope.
Oh.
These are house sparrows. Whoops. House sparrows. We covered these last time. They are a species that originated in the Middle East and has now spread around the world. Okay, they can be found on every continent except for Antarctica. They like to live around people. They even live inside buildings. I've seen them in airports. They can get into factories, warehouses, big box retail stores, that sort of stuff. They're a problem because they compete with other species for cavity nests. So holes in trees or bird boxes and that sort of stuff. These guys are starlings. And this is what's called a murmuration. Spelled right. So starlings, the US population is estimated to be between 50 to 200 million starlings. And during certain times of the year, they will form these massively large flocks, and they fly through the air, and they make these amazing shapes and movements. And I didn't leave a link up, but we can go try and find one. I meant to put a link up here. All right. Yes, yes, dude, we're so impressed. So you can see these huge numbers of birds just moving around, in really making these complex looking shapes and structures. It's amazing to see them. I mean, the videos are amazing, but they're even more amazing in real life. I've never seen a really big one of these. I've seen some small ones, and they're very impressive. They tend to be early in the day or late in the day, just before evening, outside of breeding season. And a lot of times these birds will roost in a common area. So they're flying around, forming these massive flocks, and then they'll all settle down into a local area to nest at night. Where can you see these? Well, starlings occur pretty much everywhere in the lower United States. So you can certainly see them in New England. You don't tend to see these massive flocks. For one reason for that is that we don't, in New England, there aren't these big open spaces where you can see huge amounts of sky, and there are trees everywhere. So the birds, first off, they're going to be more scattered around because there are so many trees around. And secondly, it's harder to spot them because of the trees. They are absolutely in Ohio. Yep. The best places to see the murmurations are places that have lots of farmland or grassland or wide open spaces with limited tree areas for them to roost in at night. All right, so starlings are not very popular. They cause an estimated $800 million in crop damage every year. They compete with native species. For food, nest sites. And these large flocks can cause problems with air travel. So if you get a murmuration over an airport, that can cause a lot of delays. The European starling is on the list of 100 worst invasive species. This is a worldwide list. And just like the house sparrow, these can be found now on pretty much every continent except Antarctica. There is a story that you may have heard that there's one person who is to blame for starlings in the US, a guy named Eugene Scheiffelman. It's this nice little story about how this guy introduced all the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare into Central Park. And I used to tell it, but I learned this year that that's probably not true. And he can't be completely blamed for the starlings because there were starlings already in the US before he came along and started releasing British birds into Central Park in New York. But he certainly did release an awful lot of birds that shouldn't be here. Okay, if you want a screenshot of this, go ahead. What about these guys? You know what these guys are, right? Pigeons, sometimes called rock pigeons or rock doves or feral pigeons. You guys know what the word feral means, don't you? What does it mean? What's a good definition of it? Faith, go ahead.
Feral basically means that a species that or basically an animal that was previously domesticated, but has since practically undomesticated itself. So I think a good example of that is the Canaan dog. The Canaan dog is a breed of dog native to Israel, and they were bred around 2000, and they were bred around biblical times. But for some reason or another, the breed fell out of style and basically went feral for 2,000 years before being re-domesticated.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, there are lots of good examples of feral dog species. Kind of getting off the topic, but the New Guinea singing dog. We think the dingo in Australia was originally descended from domesticated animals. There's a group called the pariah dogs. There's there's a population of long feral dogs in the Southeast, in the Carolinas, that have also reverted pretty much to being mostly wild. Just like when you get these feral species of dogs, if you get one of these dogs as a young puppy and you raise it in your house, it's going to be not completely like a domesticated dog, but much more comfortable around people than, say, a wild wolf would be. Wolves and wolf hybrids make horrible pets. They don't do well in domestic situations. Feral pigeons are the same thing. They were previously domesticated. They've been domesticated for somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 years. And humans have taken pigeons everywhere they've gone. Again, this is a bird that can be found on every continent and probably every island, or every large island at least, except for Antarctica. Even wild pigeons who haven't really been raised by people will let you get really close to them if you move slowly and gently. It's hard to tell if there's any environmental problems with these guys because they tend to be around human settlements and civilization. And they seem to have spread with about the same time as people spread around the world. So they really followed us closely during human spread. Yep, there can be some subtle variations from different areas where they're found. And a lot like New Guinea singing dogs, if you raise a pigeon from a baby, it is fine as a pet. Pigeons have the advantage that the feral populations are often hybridized with still domesticated pigeons. So lots of people still keep these guys. They allow them to fly outside, and so they can hybridize. Okay, I've got 2 questions in the chat. Why are they defined as pests? So these guys are descended from species that lived in the Middle East. They're considered a pest species because they have reproduced in large numbers in areas where they are not from, and because they have domestic genes. So they're not a truly wild species. If you were to compare handling one of these pigeons with handling a wild species of pigeon, you can tell the difference. So when I was in wildlife rehab, we would get lots of pigeons in. And we would get these domestic pigeons, and then there's a wild species that lives in the same area. And handling them was day and night, completely different. A pigeon like this one, a rock pigeon that had lived its entire life in the wild, you could pick it up, you could handle it. It wouldn't like it, but it didn't stress out. Whereas if you handled the wild species pigeon, you had to be careful not to stress it too much. It would get very stressed. It would fight a lot harder to get out of your hands when you were doing something to it. And, you could literally stress birds to death if you messed with it too long, but you can't do that with rock pigeons. So that's why they're considered feral, and that's why they're considered a pest species. Why not Antarctica? Antarctica is cold. That's part of it. There's also long periods of time where there's not a lot of good food availability. So if there's, in the Antarctic winter, there would be nothing for them to eat because everything would be covered with snow and ice. Okay, so that's rock pigeons. These are a very underappreciated bird. I really like these guys. So if you need a screenshot, go ahead. Mary, go ahead.
My iPad crapped out, so I can't take any screenshots.
Oh, I used to depend on looking at you and I could see the flash when it took the screenshot. Well, it's all on video. I also want to talk a little bit about feral parrots. So there are at least 25 non-native parrots that are breeding in the US, 25 species. There used to be 2 native species of parrots. The one right above that's got an X through it, that was the Carolina parakeet. And that is now extinct. The other one, which is pictured to the right, is the thick-billed parrot. It used to be found in Arizona and New Mexico. It still exists in places in Mexico, but no longer within the United States. Both of these were basically driven out of the US by deforestation and by hunting. So these are our native parrots. Anybody besides Mary who takes screenshots, go ahead. One of the most common species of parrots that is still living in, or it's become an invasive species here in the US, is the monk parakeet. So they're bigger than budgies, but they're not as big as, say, the Amazon parrots. These birds were imported in the US in large numbers starting in the 50s and 60s. And as we should all know by now, a lot of people got these birds and then said, hey, wait a minute, they're messy, they're noisy, they're demanding, they bite. And what did people do? They released them. Now, monk parakeets, yep, they put them outside, exactly. Monk parakeets adapt very well to urban settings. And they can be found in at least 21 states. They can be found in New York City. They can be found in Chicago. They can be found in Boston. The Boston parakeets, there's a small population. They've certainly built nests. This is a nest here on the right. As far as I know, they haven't successfully bred, but the ones in New York City and in Chicago have bred in those locations. You can see these guys build massive, huge nests. And you can get multiple pairs breeding in the same nest site. And they love power lines like this. Why do you think this might be a problem?
Fire.
Yes, it's a huge fire hazard. Yeah, a lot of places will take them down because of that danger. It hasn't completely eliminated the problem. they're still, breeding fine in lots of lots of different places. You'll also see them on light poles sometimes. So this pole has a light attached to it, but if you have a pole that just has the light, sometimes they'll nest on those too. Okay, clearing the images. This photo was taken in a suburb of San Francisco. So when we're talking about feral parrots, the places that are most likely to have feral parrots, can you guys guess what they are? What states? 3 of them. California, Florida, Texas. Good. Perfect job, guys. When we talk about these locations, there are more than 35 species of parrot that have formed breeding colonies in the Miami area. These include things like blue and gold macaws, as well as, Amazon parrots, like these guys. The blue and gold macaws in the Miami area are being poached, although I'm putting poached in parentheses, in quotation marks, because they're not a native species. They have no legal protections. Go ahead, Faith.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, like, if anything was being done about the invasion, but that does seem like a good idea, because I mean, for birds, we mentioned before that it's very difficult to spay or neuter birds because of the anesthesia risk. So unfortunately, I do believe euthanasia is the most humane option for many of these birds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're absolutely right there. There's not a good way to deal with these feral populations. The parrots are not generally causing as much problem as like the starlings and the house sparrows. And unfortunately, if you've got tens or hundreds of millions of birds, you're not going to get rid of them. They're here to stay. So the starlings and the house sparrows, they're just here to stay. Could we get rid of the parrots? Yeah, quite possibly. But yeah, I mean, if people want pets, if they take babies from the wild for the pet trade, that might be okay, maybe. Reducing the wild populations and reducing the pressure on, for example, smuggling operations that would import like the blue and gold macaws for the pet trade. The Amazon parrots in San Francisco are famous. What are they? Parrots of something Hill, Telegraph Hill, I think it is. That might not be the right street name. But they are declining. Due to, dun, 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 exposure to rat poison. these three states make a lot of sense for parrots to become comfortable, widespread, pesty, because parrots tend to be tropical in nature, and these states all have relatively mild winters and moderately tropical or close to tropical habitats. But I mean, you can see this guy's porch. He's obviously feeding them, but talk about making a huge mess. Okay, one more slide on invasive species here. So I'm going to clear this. In Phoenix, Arizona, there's a population of around 2,000 rosy-faced lovebirds. Lovebirds are a warm weather species, but the temperatures in Phoenix regularly get over 100 degrees. They can even get over 110 degrees. The native area where you find these lovebirds rarely gets over 100. So they're not well adapted for these extreme high temperatures. In their native habitat on hot days, they use water to keep cool. It's not an option in Arizona. Not a lot of water around. But lovebirds are parrots, and parrots are clever. And they have discovered that air conditioning vents blow slightly cooler air outside. And even a few degrees cooler can make the difference between surviving and not surviving. So you can see this is a building on the campus of the University of Arizona. This is a place where the air conditioning system blows air outside. And you can see that these guys are perching right in front of this air conditioning vent to cool off a little bit. Yep. They wouldn't survive without people because they need that slightly cooler air from the air conditioning ducts, as well as artificial water sources. I threw these guys in because, I mean, how smart are they to figure this out? Okay, so that's invasive bird species in the US. Any questions on these guys? Nope. All right. In that case, our next topic is wildlife rehabilitation. So I have, let me see how many years. Between volunteering and working full-time in wildlife rehab, I think I've got 7 years of experience. I have not done it recently. It's been a while. But this is based on my experience. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Why do the monk parakeets make nests on power line poles? Oh, that's a really good question. Probably it's related to lack of appropriate sized or adequately large trees. That's probably why it is, but that is a a real guess, Abigail. I'm really not sure. All right, going back to wildlife rehab, approximately 60% of animals that come to wildlife rehab are birds. The next biggest category is small mammals, often orphaned, which may or may not really be orphaned. So squirrels that fell out of a nest. Here's the thing with baby squirrels. If the baby squirrel is warm and at the base of the tree, mom can come back down and pick it up. So if you find a baby squirrel on the ground and it's not obviously injured, make sure it's warm and leave it in a spot. Give mom a good half an hour to come get it, come back in half an hour. And if it's not gone, then maybe bring it into rehab. What do I mean by orphaned? In this situation, orphaned means for some reason, the mother is not around anymore, or the baby is somewhere where mom can't find it. Sometimes this happens because they're rejected. Yes, Faith, sometimes they're rejected. Sometimes there was a storm and they fell out of the tree. Sometimes a person finds them and picks them up and takes them to rehab. And they were fine. Wild animals have to leave their babies alone sometimes. Whereas with people, if you see a baby laying on the street, okay, that baby's going to need help. People don't leave their babies on the street, but mother squirrels, mother possums, mother rabbits, mother deer, they all have to go out and find food, and they will leave their babies behind, especially when they're very young. Possums, mom can lose track of them. Mother possums can have she has 13 nipples, so she can have up to 13 babies in her pouch. And then once they get bigger and they start hanging on her back, she really can't carry 13 of them around and she can't count that high. So sometimes she will lose track of them. But sometimes people just see a small possum and they go, that's a baby, I'm going to pick it up. If it's reached 10 inches, which is, let's see, smaller than the length of a sheet of paper, right? So probably about from here to here. If it's that big, it's fine. They become independent at a relatively small size, as do rabbits. Baby rabbits stay in a nest, so there's a nest on the ground. When they're too small to be independent, mom will come and visit them maybe a couple of times a day, really not very often. She feeds them and they leave. Rabbits also mature very, very, very quickly. If the ears are upright, if they can lift their ears up, and if they're bigger than the size of your fist, they're fine. They're probably on their own. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, when I was living in Australia, I wound up having a couple of rabbits, and one of them got pregnant, and she dug a hole in the backyard. And I know they dig holes and everything, so I didn't think anything of it. But she kept coming up and covering the hole. And then she would dig it up and go down to feed them. And then one night she was in her cage and I was in the house and she just kept rattling at the cage. So I finally went out in the middle of the night to see what was going on. And I opened it up and she ran over to where the babies were, undug it, went down. And then when she came back up, she never covered the hole. And all these little things, they were like this big. Bing, 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 bing. I had like 21 rabbits in the backyard at one time.
Those rabbits are a different species than the native rabbits in the US.
Oh, okay.
So the native ones in the US don't dig nests.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's funny. That is funny. Rabbits are a huge problem in Australia. Deer, baby deer are often frequently kidnapped. So if you see a baby deer, still has spots, holding very still, leave it alone. Holding still for rabbits, baby rabbits and baby deer, that's their anti-predator defense. Not a great anti-predator defense, right? But they hold very, very still and hope that they're not spotted. So you're a predator. If they're laying there, leave them. If a baby deer is vocalizing and walking around, it needs help. And of course, any mammal or bird caught by a cat needs help because of those bacteria in a cat's mouth can kill them. Wildlife rehab rarely gets reptiles. Usually the reptiles are aquatic turtles. Some places won't take venomous snakes. Others will. Massachusetts has very, very few venomous snakes. So this is just your overview of what types of animals tend to come in to wildlife rehab the most. All right, so if you want a screenshot, now's a good time. Why not venomous snakes? Because venomous snakes, it's a different skill set to handle a venomous snake. You've got to know how to handle them so that you don't end up getting bitten. And not everybody knows how. So what kinds of wildlife rehab can you do without a permit? It varies by state. A lot of states you can handle squirrels and possums and rabbits without permits. A lot of places, a lot of states you can do that. Bird species require a federal permit. Except for the invasives. Like pigeons, starlings, and house sparrows. Most states require special permits for birds. And if you're looking at doing raptors, especially eagles or endangered species, you need additional permits. What else requires permits? Species that are rabies vectors. So species that are most likely to transmit rabies to a person, like bats, raccoons, and skunks. What do I mean by special permits? I mean that if you want to rehabilitate raccoons, you need a permit from the state to legally be able to do that. Does that clear that up, Abigail? Okay, good. Rabies vectors, permits are required because they can transmit rabies if they bite a person. And rabies, as you guys probably know, if it's not caught early, generally before symptoms show up, it's basically 100% fatal. So people who have permits to work with bats, raccoons, and skunks are going to have rabies vaccinations. Yeah, getting their saliva in a paper cut or anything like that will also transmit rabies. Absolutely. And like I said, once you start having a lot of symptoms, that is a sign that you've got brain damage and you're screwed. You have it. I hope you mean the vaccine, Fiona. Yes. Yeah, I've had the rabies series. I didn't find it was that bad for me. Kind of like a flu shot, but 10 shots. Oh, you got the post-exposure shots. That's very different from the pre-exposure vaccine. Yeah, that I've heard is a lot worse. Yes, very thick, lots of liquid. But it's still a hell of a lot better than getting rabies. Wow. That's rough. What did you get bitten by, Fiona? Cat. Cats, in my understanding, in the US, most human rabies cases come from a cat. Because, you know, lots of people handle them and cats can be tricky to handle. Oh, it's crazy in Ipswich right now. Okay, that's good to know. Nobody mess around with skunks. Oh, you do a lot of necropsies. Oh, cool. Yeah, I figured out what you meant. Raccoons, yeah, I don't like to work with raccoons. Not only can they carry rabies, they can also carry raccoon roundworm, which is a parasite that can go to your brain. So, and that it's a very nasty parasite and it's very, very hard to kill. Yeah. Yeah, Chelsea, that's a good plan. Limit how many people handle them. When I was doing rehab, we would keep the raccoons in a separate building, limit who was allowed to work with them, and the caging and materials that we used on the raccoons were raccoon only. We wouldn't then use them with like possums or squirrels or something because bleach doesn't kill the roundworm. So very, very hard to get rid of that. Predators, if you're going to work with predators, you're going to need extra permits. The foxes, coyotes and bobcats. If you think a feral cat or an angry cat is bad, bobcats are nicknamed the flying blenders. They're really, really fun to deal with. Bears, generally speaking, I don't think anybody does rehab with bears. Adult bears are just too difficult to deal with, too dangerous to deal with. And cubs, if they're orphaned, we cannot train them how to be a wild bear. So a lot of the bears at zoos, like the Stone Zoo has bears, those were orphaned cubs that were found when their mother died. We can't train them to be wild. Adult deer, moose, not usually done. Again, especially with moose, they're too big, they're too dangerous, but adult deer and moose are prone to what's called capture myopathy. I talked about capture myopathy with you guys. Does that sound familiar? I'm getting mostly yeses. Somebody forgets what it is. That's okay. So capture myopathy is a condition where an animal that is trapped or chased for a long time period gets such high stress levels that it causes the breakdown of their muscles, and it's ultimately fatal. So adult deer in captivity get capture myopathy and die. So there's no point in trying to rehab them if they're going to die from just being in captivity. I already mentioned endangered species need a special permit. These organizations are organizations that are really valuable sources of information about wildlife rehabilitation. So in Massachusetts, the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife regulates permits for wildlife rehabilitation. The National Wildlife Rehabilitation Association and the International Wildlife Rehabilitators Council are organizations of wildlife rehabbers. So they do training classes, they help explain regulations, all kinds of stuff. So these three sites are all going to have really good information. And I'm going to put this part in red. If you're in Massachusetts, to find a licensed rehabber, check the Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife website. They have a lot of good information on it about dealing with wildlife, and they have a list of licensed rehabbers and what types of animals those rehabbers take. And I'm going to put stars around this one. If you're in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire version of Fish and Wildlife. Vermont version of Fish and Wildlife. Sometimes they have slightly different names, but the Fish and Wildlife for the state that you're in is going to have that list of rehabbers. And that is the place to look. And I'm putting a bunch of stars on this and I'm talking about it over and over and over again, because every year after I've taught this class, sometime in the summer, someone will email me and ask me about where they can find a rehabber. And I don't mind answering that question. You're always welcome to email me, even after the class is over, with any bird related question. But during the summer, I may not check my email on time. And I have come back from vacation and found emails that were, sent 2 weeks before. And I'm like, oh, I hope she found somebody. I hope they found some place to take that injured, blah, 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 blah. So this is how you find one when I'm not available. Okay, I'm going to clear this screen. Now, wildlife rehabilitation is not for the tender-hearted. Over half of all animals that come into wildlife rehab do not survive. People who do babies have higher success rates because a lot of those animals were perfectly fine and somebody picked them up and brought them in. People who specialize in adults these individuals are more likely to come in with injuries. You're not catching an adult rabbit unless something's wrong with it. You're not catching an adult hawk unless something's wrong with it. So these have higher mortality rates. So they lose a lot more of those individuals. And of course, it's going to vary by species. Here's a prime example, rabbits. They have high mortality in facilities that handle different species. But they have relatively low mortality for individuals who just do rabbits in their homes. So if I have an injured rabbit, I really want somebody who just does rabbits, who does it in their home, who doesn't have volunteers. They're the only person who interacts with those rabbits. Rabbits can die from stress very, very easily. And when you're in a place where you have different people handling the rabbits, that causes them more stress than having the same person handle them all the time. And if you've got a place that handles lots of different species, those tend to be a lot busier. So you get a lot more coming and going, a lot more noise, a lot more activity, which stresses the rabbits. And it's very, very hard to do a good job with rabbits if you're in a facility that has 200 animals on any given day and 2 staff members. All right, I'm going to clear this one. What is this bird? I'll tell you it's a robin, but how old is this bird? Yeah, fledgling, good. Yeah, old enough to be left alone. You can see the gape flanges here on the side of the mouth and the complete lack of a tail. Peak intake for wildlife rehab. The highest number of patients occurs in spring and summer. And a lot of this is because people find fledglings. And they pick them up and they bring them in. and cats find them. If your cat finds them, it needs to come in. The most frequent saying during the spring and summer in wildlife rehabilitation is put the bird back. People call in, they describe what they've got, and you're like, okay, so it has feathers, it can stand on its own, it doesn't have a tail, it's not injured, leave it alone. Same thing happens with rabbits and deer fawn. And this is the #1 cause of animals coming to wildlife rehab. It doesn't matter if your cat is well fed, well behaved. People have done those studies. They've put little cameras on collars around the necks of house cats that wander around outside. And first off, cats go a lot further away from home than anybody realizes. And secondly, every cat that they've looked at that does this hunts. They don't always eat the prey, but they kill things. So free roaming cats is a huge, huge problem. In addition to that, a cat that is allowed outside has a life expectancy less than half of that of a cat that is kept indoors 24 hours a day. Yeah, cats will sometimes bring in, bits and pieces. So my cats that I have had that I've kept indoors have, except for one, have lived to be at least 17 years old, and one of them lived for over 20 years. And that's kind of the normal range you should expect for a cat that's kept indoors. Cats that go outdoors, even part-time, they're going to have a much shorter life expectancy. They can get hit by cars, they can get poisoned, they can be killed by dogs, psychopaths, all kinds of stuff. Dead birds on your doorstep could definitely be because of cats. Yes, cats that go outside can be can get diseases from other cats. They can get in fights. There's a lot of bad things that can happen to a cat. They're just, it's out there on its own. They're small. Okay. That's one of my rants. All right. When in doubt, you find an animal, you're not sure if it needs to go into wildlife rehabilitation, call. If the animal is not clearly injured, leave it alone and call the rehabber for advice. If it is clearly injured, put it in a box, put it in a quiet, dark place, and then call your rehabber. Again, State Fish and Wildlife is going to have a list of rehabbers. A lot of times animal control or animal shelters will also have contact information for rehabbers. The state list is going to be up to date. The average wildlife rehabber lasts about 5 years in the field. In that, working in wildlife rehab. It is a physically and emotionally exhausting job. If you're interested in it, volunteers are often welcome. If you want to say you're inspired by me talking about how rabbits are special and they need to be done at home, and maybe you like, well, I have a spare room, I could do rabbits. You need to get training first, and you can get training by volunteering with somebody else. Volunteers usually start out doing the dirty work, cleaning cages, doing laundry, cleaning dishes, and then progress to more difficult tasks. Okay. If you have a so-called nuisance wildlife problem, call a rehabber or check the websites of the National Wildlife Rehabbers Association and the International Wildlife Rehabbers Council, or State Fish and Game, or Fish and Wildlife. Those often have really good information about how to deal with pest animals. If you just do a Google search, you're going to find pest control companies. Pest control companies do not have the animal's best interest at heart, and they don't have your best interest at heart. They're there to make money. So they may be able to help, but it may not be the best source of information or help for these problems. Okay. We're going to have more to talk about with wildlife rehabilitation next week, but this is a really good place for me to stop. Are there any questions before we head out? Looks like nope. All right, guys, have a good weekend. I will see you guys on Tuesday.